should say start anytime. You're good to go.
This is Kent with Cleaver Farm and Home, and we'll get started here on our second day of sheep and goat class. We're very proud today to have Dr. Don Bliss, veterinary parasitologist from Mid-America Ag Research, and Kyra Woods from Merck Animal Health. We appreciate Kyra for setting everything up and getting Don set up. And Dr. Bliss, if you would like to start the program.
All right, I'm ready. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I know that word parasitologist, we have two types of parasitologists. One is what we call an applied, and the other one's academia, and I'm the applied type. So we spend most of our time in the field. We do have a lab, Mid-America Ag Research, and with that, I have a website. Feel free to do this. It's just midamericaresearch.net. So feel free to go on. I've got a lot of the things I'm talking about today will be on this website. Guide to Parasites, strategic deworming strategies for all species, sheep and goats is on there, and reference material. So feel free to use it. You can click on Tests Now and download a small ruminant form if you want to send samples in. Make sure your sponsor is, I would put down Kyra or certainly Merck. If you know your rep, if it's put that on your form so we know where they're coming from, and it's a sponsored form. So when you get, and I'll come back and talk about this, but when you get your results back on that website, it'll tell you exactly how to collect samples, how to run samples, how to fill out your forms. Everything's on there. So I won't go into too much detail on it, but certainly whatever animals you put on that form, we will mark down the type of parasite we see and a total count at the end, and I'll walk through what that means as we go down the road. So one of the big things with sheep and goats is you never know where they are, and you run fecals. Fecals are the most important thing. You can look at some animals out there and say, hey, do they have worms or not? Yeah, maybe. But once you pull a fecal, you'll know exactly what's going on with your animals. And so we'll walk through exactly how to do that and how often it should be done. You take animals that are out there and they've grazed their pastures down. More than likely, these animals are pretty heavily contaminated, but until you run that fecal, we don't know. So with sheep and goats, it's a lot different than cattle in that we lose thousands of sheep and goats every year from parasites, and of course, it's one of those things that they can strike just overnight. You can one day your animal looks fine, next day they're weak or even dead. So one of the things we want to do is stay ahead of that with our fecals and our treatment strategies, and that's what I'll be spending most of my time on treatment and how we can overcome this, because we want to prevent this anemia. We want to prevent these animals from being because once they get into that anemic state, very, very difficult to save them. So we look at primarily the parasites that we see that are causing the biggest problems. Obviously, the number one that's most famous is your Haemonchus or the barber pole worm. That's a bloodsucker. It lives in the abomasum stomach. It is the one that causes the primary anemia, and the one that you're checking eyelids to see how severe it is. But we also have a lot of sheep that die from nematodirus. I'll talk a little bit about that. Whipworm, nematodirus lives in the small intestine. Whipworm lives in the cecum, and then of course coccidia is a big. So we want to make sure we kind of cover these. One thing about goats is keep in mind is they're a lot more susceptible even than sheep, because they are traditional browsers, and we kind of put them on pasture and make them graze. And they have a very poor immunity to parasites. So they are the most susceptible animal to parasites. So if you put them on a pasture and let that pasture contamination build up to a high level, you're probably going to have some pretty sick goats. So we got to be very careful. Not that you don't have problems with sheep, and you do, but the goat is especially sensitive. There's a lot of things that affect these parasites, and one of the biggest one is stocking rate. how long your animals have been on that pasture as far as contaminating the pasture. Obviously weather, immune status, all these other things affect it. But if you overstock your animals, you almost guaranteed are going to have some problems. I was in Georgia here a few years ago and talking to Dr. Kaplan down at the University of Georgia, and he's saying, oh, well, we had all this resistance problem with parasites, and he said there was one herd we didn't have any resistance on. And I said, well, tell me about that herd. And he said, well, we had, I think we had 25 goats on 75 acres. And so, what that tells you is that as you increase that density, you increase the parasite population, and the more issues you're going to have. So make sure you keep an eye on that. One of the reasons that we're having all these problems, and we've had them for a long time. The first problem, and I don't have it on the slide, but the first problem is that if you could have this, you could have a do-over where you make sure you bring worm-free animals onto your place. Worm-free animals will stay worm-free forever. You have to bring the parasites in there. So what happened over the years is people buy an animal, sheep, goats, whatever, and bring them onto their place, and those animals are wormy. Now they contaminated that place, and now everything starts, and the next thing you know, first year it does pretty good, second year not so good, and third year you start seeing real problems, and that's because you brought the parasites with them. So we'll walk through a lot of strategies on keeping these animals clean and trying to prevent, making sure you don't ship animals in or out without having them clean. And timing's the crucial. When you deworm, if you wait until the problem has occurred, you're too late. You've got to prevent it. So it's all about prevention. So, and that's what we'll talk about mostly today. These parasites come from the environment of the animal. So they're contaminating their environment, and then they reinfect themselves over the summer. So as the summer goes on, the parasite buildup occurs, and that's when the problems start. So our main goal is to keep that parasite level low on the pasture, and once we control that, we can solve these problems and keep them from going and make them go away, and that's very possible in nearly all operations. What happens if you allow, if an animal's shedding a high level, you just take a goat that's shedding 1,000 eggs in a gram, you multiply that times 454, grams to a pound, that's almost 500,000 eggs per pound of manure going onto that pasture. So you think about that. If those animals, if you turn them out in April and come July, you got 100 million eggs just by one animal on that pasture. So that reinfection rate is tremendous. And so you can see when we come back to this, I'll show you how we want to prevent that from happening. If you wait until you deworm in the summertime, a lot of things happen that aren't going to help you. It's kind of like a shotgun approach to hit and miss. You go in there and treat these animals. You put them right back on that same pasture, your dewormers last you about 2 hours. Once that pasture buildup has occurred and the animals are starting to get sick, you have to get them off that pasture. So again, we'll go back to our preventative strategy. And our whole goal is strategic time deworming. Is the time the deworming at the time of the year when we can prevent the parasite buildup on the pasture. So that occurs through the winter and early spring. You want those animals to go through the winter worm-free and then not shed eggs on that spring pasture. And that becomes the whole strategy is to prevent that buildup on the pasture. So, obviously, like we mentioned, treatment is if you wait till now to treat your animals, like I said, the pasture's already contaminated. You have to move those animals out of there if they're having severe problems. Where do these parasites come from? Now you got to remember they can survive from one year to another. So about 30% of the parasites that are on the pasture in the fall of this year will survive through the spring of 2021. The animals start grazing those pastures in the spring. They pick those parasites up. They grow to an adult worm. They shed eggs back on that pasture, and the pasture contamination starts all over again. So these larvae that survive the winter, they do have a limited life once they make it through the winter. They will die off in about 60 days if they're not eaten by the animals. But obviously, if your animals are eating them and they grow to an adult worm, they're shedding those eggs back out, and the cycle starts again for next year, just as year after year. So, the whole thing is that one of the things that happen with goats and sheep, especially, we don't see it in cattle as much, but once this worm burden becomes very high, the incoming parasites that they pick up on that pasture will not develop. They will go into an inhibited or an arrested development. So if you come into the year right now, you haven't really dewormed, your animals are starting to look poor. The new parasites they pick up every day. Now, if they're picking up thousands every day, you can see what happens is those parasites go into an inhibited form. And then as you go into the fall and you get into kind of a winter situation, the old worms start to die off as you go into the winter. These worms in the gut will start to come out, and then you got a problem again. And a lot of times you check your animals in February and March, and they're full of worms. So that's because these inhibited are now redeveloping and get ready to contaminate that spring pasture. Once these organisms become into an inhibited or arrested development, very difficult to kill them. What happens is you'll deworm the animal, come back a week later, you check them, they're full of worms. It's not because they picked up more worms, it's not probably because of total resistance. It's probably because these parasites in the tissues have now emerged and are starting to lay eggs again. So we'll keep in mind that one of the reasons that we want to keep that pasture contamination level low is so that our dewormers work and we're not filling these animals up with inhibited parasites. So again, I mentioned from season to season, what happens is that the infective larvae is the one that survives the winter. So they survive the winter, are available on the spring pasture, and it starts to start the whole cycle over again. And I'll show you some graphics. This is the barber pole worm. I think you're anybody that's raised sheep and goats will know what this looks like. These are the inhibited. They go into that gastric gland. Every one of these little nodules, I can tease a larvae out of there. So when that animal cycles through that gastric gland, if that worm burden is at a high level and the pH is quite high, that tells these parasites stop developing. You don't want to keep going because it's not in their best interest to kill those animals. Because if they kill your animals, they die with it. So what they do is they go into an inhibited phase. They stay in these glands until you go into the winter. The old worms die off, the gut starts to improve, and then out they come. And that's just in time for the next season. So these are very damaging, very hard to control parasites. These are the gastric glands, basically. These are an existing gland that produces HCl. So that HCl is the acid that the animals are using to digest fiber. When the sheep and goats are out there chewing on fiber, you need this acid in there to turn that into feed stuff. When that larvae goes into that gland, it forms a mucus plug over that gland. That's what you saw on that last slide. And then that larva will go through a double molt. So it comes in as an L3 larva, it molts to an L4, and then as to an early L5, which emerges out and develops into an egg-laying adult parasite on the surface of the gut. It attaches to the gut wall when it comes out, and it's actually interesting because that barber pole worm, not only is it a bloodsucker, but it also releases a anticoagulant. So if it moves it releases one site, moves to another site, that site it left will stay and bleed for several hours after it's done because it has this anticoagulant in it. While it's in that gland, though, it crushes the gland. So that gland is not producing HCl anymore, and so the pH of the surface will start to rise as the parasite burden increases. So as the parasite burden gets higher and higher, the pH goes up. As the pH goes up, digestion goes down. As digestion goes down, you start getting pot-bellied animals, and you start seeing where those animals are no longer digesting the fiber properly. They're not hungry. They lay down a lot, and now this is when the problems really start. Also, while they're in that gland, it's a very vascular area, so the animal is sending mast cells down to fight those parasites off. This is the immune system that your animals are using to try to ward off these parasites. And what happens is it produces what we call a T helper 2 cell to fight off the parasites. And as if actively doing that, it can't make Th1s, which is necessary to fight off bacteria, viruses, coccidia. So with a heavy worm burden, you depress that animal's immune system and make it more susceptible to other diseases such as coccidiosis. By getting those animals cleaned up and getting those worms out of there, most of the time they can handle that coccidia by itself. So just these parasites are not only bad for the animal itself, but also for its immune system. And I won't go too much into it, but it's basically, if you think about it, your animals are grazing from spring to fall. That means they're producing these Th2s every single day. That's going to downregulate their ability to have active Th1 cells. So their response is going to be quite strong. Now, these parasites themselves, they have two functions in life. One, obviously, is to live off your animals. You can see this organism is taking a plug of gut. It's sucking on the blood. It's laying eggs. And what our goal with the strategic time deworming is stop the egg shedding. We want to stop the egg shedding in the spring because that's where the population buildup starts. So we're going to attack that animal by getting that egg count shut down in the spring. So that's why we want to get those fecal exams in, see where you are, monitor them throughout the whole year, and keep an eye on where your parasite diagnosis is going to become pretty important in trying to get these animals cleaned up. Again, if you're buying or selling animals, make sure you got a fecal done. If you're bringing the animal onto your property, isolate it, get a fecal done, get it cleaned up if it needs to be, and make sure that they're not bringing worms into an operation where you start to get them cleaned up. We use a modified Wisconsin sugar flotation. It's by far the most sensitive. Obviously, with sheep and goats, you can use a lot of other different techniques, but most of the techniques will miss low egg shedders, and they overestimate high egg shedders. With a modified Wisconsin, it's a very, very, very sensitive technique. We can find a lot of low egg shedding parasites that are missed by the other techniques. We also can set these labs up. Merck has a program where we actually go out in the country and set up parasite clinics, have people come and bring your samples in. So this is something we can talk to the Merck people about having some set up where we can actually do them on site. But of course, I don't know, with COVID, we aren't doing too many. But basically, the instructions on that lab, my website, are how to pick up these fecals. We just use a Ziploc bag. You put it over your hand. You only need a couple pellets, so make sure they're nice and fresh. And you want to keep them nice and cool when you ship them. So make sure you freeze a bottle of water or a freezer pack to put in your sample to keep them cool, and they'll come in great shape. So when we look at them, we actually pull the egg up with a sugar flotation technique. It does not distort the egg, so we can identify it right down to whether it's an Hemoncus, Ocertagia, Dimbityrus. We can identify the parasite that we see in all animals. These are the basic parasites that we see most common in goats, which is your barber pole worm, Hemoncus, that Nematodaris I talked about. The tapeworm is very prevalent in sheep and goats. In baby goats, we get Aspergillosis, which is a threadworm. This can kill the goats if you're lambing or kidding in a wet area. These threadworms can become quite prolific, and they can cause a lot of problems. You'll get a white scours with it. Very, very hard to control without deworming them. Whipworm is another parasite we see, and we see that a lot in confined goats or goats that are on dry lot or sheep that are on dry lot. It lives in the cecum, and you only need a couple hundred parasites to kill an animal with those. So if you see a whipworm egg comes back on your forms, you're probably going to want to get those animals treated. The other thing about the whipworm is that egg could live in the soil or on a dry lot type situation for 30, 40 years. So any eggs that go out there, you're going to have a problem next year after, so forth. So you want to get it shut down. And nodule worm we see primarily in adult animals, but it can be, again, severe. And of course, coccidia is an issue. In the older goats, we seem to see the tapeworms, the Hemoncus, nodule worms. The younger goats or sheep, we see more coccidia, tapeworms, whipworms. nematodarus, and then as they get to grazing, they'll start seeing more barber pole worms. Usually barber pole worm will only survive on grass, and that's where we see the problem. So this is a picture of the Hemonchus, which is a barber pole worm. It's not uncommon to have a field that looks like this, where we got goats that are shedding thousands of eggs in a sample. This is a nematodarus egg, very big egg. It's much bigger than the Hemonchus. Again, you only see a few eggs, you got a problem. It lives in that first third of the small intestine, winds through the villi of the small intestine, and it actually causes that animal to have very poor nutritional uptake. The other parasite we see quite a bit in sheep and goats is tapeworm. This is a field of tapeworm eggs. These tapeworms can be quite long, 3 to 4 feet long in a sheep or goat. And you can imagine if you've got 4 or 5 of these worms, we find them all knotted up in the gut, and they can stop or slow down the digestive system. So it becomes very important. Whipworm, easy to identify, but a low egg shedder. A lot of the other techniques will miss it. And again, especially on dry lot animals or animals that are in more of a confined area, it can be a very important parasite. And this is the threadworm that I mentioned that we see a lot in babies. Nodular worm in the large intestine, so that's an important one. And this is a field of coccidia. This animal's obviously got some scouring going on, but it's very common to see this many coccidia in a sample. All right, so let's talk about seasonal control. Our whole goal is to create that least cost, most effective treatment program that's going to prevent a problem for the entire year. We want to control these parasites for the entire season. So our strategy is going to be built around that environmental contamination. All right. So we want to start off. We want to have animals worm-free. Come this fall and clean them up. Have them going into the winter clean. We want to come back in late February and March and check them. And if any of these parasites have been coming out of the tissues, we want to get them. We want to aggressively get rid of them so that they're going on spring pastures without shedding eggs. And then we're going to aggressively deworm these animals as a whole herd for the next 60 to 90 days to clean up the cycle. And I'll walk through how we do this. Deworming right now, unless you've got real serious problems, is probably not going to help your pasture contamination. So as these animals graze, and they graze down closer to the parasites are down low. So at first they're shedding eggs and they're picking up grass, but as they graze that pasture down, they're going to be picking up those parasites. Now, I know a lot of you have heard a lot or participated in the FAMACHA. The problem with FAMACHA, there's several problems with it, but part of the problem is that you're allowing those animals to become anemic before you treat them. You start checking their eyelids, and once their eyelids become white, then you're now in trouble. So our whole goal is to prevent it. Don't allow it to get to that situation. And then once you find out with FAMACHA that you got a problem, you treat that animal, then you're going to have to treat it again next week, and then you got another one to treat, and then you got another one to treat, and it just keeps on going. You never get ahead of it. And if you strictly practice FAMACHA, we had a sheep herd in southeast Kansas, right down where you guys are. They lost over 3,000 head before we got down there and got them. They were checking them, and they were dying 150 a day. So you got to be very careful not to get those animals to that point before it gets there. So it's a very labor intensive. You got to go in there and every week or 2 weeks check their eyes and make sure and pull out and treat the ones that are showing bad. And of course, if you've got a large number of animals like this, it's an impossible job to do. So the idea of FAMACHA was to leave susceptible parasites. Question? No. Is to leave the susceptible population on the pasture, but the problem is that refugia is also what causes that damage to your animals. So at what point that refugia is too large, that's what's killing the animal. So we can practice FAMACHA, we can keep a refugia out there, but we want to keep that refugia below the level that's going to hurt the animals. So if you think about it, if I go out there and wait and deworm an animal say it's got 300,000 parasites, and even if I'm doing 90%, I'm going to leave 30,000 parasites. If I go out and treat an animal with 10,000 parasites, I'm only going to leave 1,000 at 90%. So the idea is that the higher the worm burden, the harder it is to clean those animals up. So you don't want to wait till those animals are full of worms and getting ready to drop dead when you're going to out and treat them, because now you're going to have to keep treating them, and you got to move them off that property or off that pasture where they're getting the issue. So, and then remember that problem about once you get to this high level and you start checking the eyelids and they're white, you also now have an inhibited problem. So now these parasites are going inhibited, and so you're not going to get them cleaned up from that point on. Usually inhibition starts right around early July and goes on through to about November, and then these inhibited parasites will start coming out in March and April for next year. So, anyways, the whole thing is a seasonal pattern. I'll walk through it and show you what we're trying to do in breaking this cycle and trying to keep preventing this inhibition from occurring. So in the spring, our goal is not to shed any eggs on that first 60 to 90 days of the spring. So once these parasites the animal gets infected, they'll start shedding eggs in about 2 to 3 weeks. So 3 weeks is our maximum. After 3 weeks, those animals are shedding a heavy load of worms. So if we're going to time our dewormer around killing these animals before they shed eggs, we're going to have to do a 3-week cycle, and that's exactly what we do. So these overwintered larvae will die off. So what happens is these animals work like a vacuum cleaner and pick them up and start to cycle over again. If we remove them on a strategic time basis, we'll prevent them from contaminating that pasture. I'll get that. So basically, this is what we see on an annual basis. You see that blue line coming through the winter. These are the parasites that survived from this year would be 2019. Those parasites, and then you see by July, those parasites are gone. You have to replace them. So the parasites that are out there they come this fall, those about a third of them will survive through the winter and be available next spring. So it's that springtime that we want. That's the weakest time of the whole cycle. That's the point we want to attack it in the spring. If you wait till you see the high blue line in the front, that's when all the larvae are out there. That's right now. So you can see what happens right now. If you deworm your animal, put them back on that pasture, they're full of worms almost immediately. So you have to prevent it over here in the spring. You can't, from now till winter, there's not much we can do. I mean, obviously you've got sick animals, you got to treat them, but then I wouldn't put them back on that pasture. So these are the larvae that survive the winter. They have a double coated, they've got an extra sheath over the top of them. They can't feed, they got to live off that digested material in the larva. So in the springtime, when these larvae become active, if they're not eaten, they die off, and that's that automatic cleanup of that spring pasture. So usually by late June, early July, those pastures are clean if you haven't replenished the parasites on that pasture. So if you actually look at data where we go out and collect fecals, you can see that yellow line. That's the larvae on the pasture. So by June, middle June, early July, those larvae are pretty well gone. Let's see. I jumped my slide, but that's okay. I'll come back to it. The red line is your fecals, and your yellow line on the back side is the built-up. So our goal is to prevent that pasture contamination. So we want the adult worms not shedding eggs at the time it's coming through the winter. So they want a 0 egg count when you start grazing. They're going to pick up larvae. Going to work like a vacuum cleaner. They're going to pick them up. We're going to time our dewormer to kill that. So that red line is your fecal egg count. The green line is your contamination. So if we look over here at August 15th, if you go out there right now, your animals are shedding high. You've got a high contamination of the pasture. So what we want to do this fall is come in and get them cleaned up. We're going to clean them up. We're going to go back in and check them in the spring. Make sure they're clean. If they're not, we're going to treat them again so that they're clean. So what happens when they're clean, then the only source of infection is going to be from the pasture from this year. So next year, if you got them clean going into the spring, the only place they're going to get infection is from the pasture of those parasites that survived the winter. So we're going to come in there, and in 3 weeks, we're going to kill everything they pick up. We'll come back in 3 weeks later, and we call it a 0, 3, 6, 9 program. They're clean to start. We treat them at 3 weeks out, 6 weeks out, and 9 weeks out. They'll be clean for 12 weeks. That means they don't shed any eggs on that pasture. So our refugia, the red line, is still there, but it's down below that threshold. And so these animals are not going to have an issue come next fall. So you're going to have them cleaned up. This is exactly what we did with that Kansas operation. They actually went back in here a couple years ago. We retrained. They got a new manager in there. We retrained their staff. They're sending fecals to us on a regular basis, and I'm watching them. And their counts are coming in very, very low. So this program will certainly work in your part of the world. So basically, you treat them. They're clean. They're clean for 3 weeks. They're getting ready to shed eggs. We treat them again. Clean for 3 weeks. We treat them again. All right, and then we clean them up in the fall. So our program is going to be that come this fall. We get them off pasture. We're going to go ahead and I do a combination deworming. We use Safeguard in the feed. With Safeguard, with small ruminant animals, anytime you use Safeguard, you want to spread the dose over 3 to 5 days. I know the label says, if you're using a suspension on 1 day feeding, but 95% of Safeguard goes right through the animals unchanged. So the sheep and goats act like a monogastric animal, just like if you look at the dog label, you look at the swine label, they're all 3 to 12 day feedings. So you want to do that with your sheep. I like to run Safeguard in there at 7.5 milligrams per kilogram, spread the dose over 3 to 5 days. And then on the 4th day, I give them Sidectin orally, or the last day of treatment, or the day after your last day of treatment, you can give them Sidectin orally. So the Safeguard's going to kill all the adults, going to kill all your tapeworms, all the other spurious parasites that are in there, and activate the ones out of the tissues, and your Sidectin coming in orally is going to clean those animals up. Those animals should be clean through the winter. You check them again in February, March to make sure they are. If they're still clean, you're good to go for the spring. So then in the springtime, we can just use the Safeguard. If you had deaths, I would do the combination for the first year where you do Safeguard plus Sidectin each time, and as you get it cleaned up, you don't have to work them. You can do Safeguard in the feed on your 0, 3, 6 program. Probably treat the last time where you work them and give them Sidectin on the last of the 3 treatments. So the deworming products that are available, I like to pick the best of the benzimidazoles, which is Safeguard, and the best of the moxidectins is the ivermectins is the Sidectin. Rumetel, and Famazole will work good in a program, but remember, if you're using it and you're using all 3, you don't have one to go to if things aren't working. I like to stay with ones that are working, and then keep the other ones for emergency. So if you've got severely infected animals right now, I would use you want to use Sidectin at 500 microgram. I do a 1 cc per 20 pounds immediately. If you got some time, you can run some Safeguard through them first, and then do the Sidectin after you finish your Safeguard. That's the best program. But if you've got some animals that are looking very pale and sick, you don't want to just rely on your Safeguard to stop them, because the Safeguard is not killing those inhibited until they get out of that tissues. So the worldwide dose is 7.5. I like to use that dose a little higher. So a pound of a 0.5% Safeguard. I think I got it here, but we'll do 750 pounds of sheep and goats. So you spread that dose over 3 to 5 days. 3 days adequate. You can do it in the mineral. You can use blocks or in the feed, and then give your Cydectin, if some people will use Dectomax if they've got heavily pregnant animals and they don't want to use Cydectin, Dectomax will work. Obviously, once you give the safeguard ahead of the Cydectin, it usually makes the Cydectin safe. We've not had any problems on a follow-up treatment, but being able to treat them without touching them every time is going to work. The blocks will work. A lot of people, what happens with the blocks, you want to put out 3 times as many as you need and mark on them or pick them up after they've eaten a third of them. So, you'll put them out for a week, pick them up for 2 weeks, put them back out for a week, pick them back up, put them back out. So you can use it. You can use the blocks as also. So, basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to treat the animals and the pasture. We're trying to create parasite safe grazing. We're trying to get rid of the issues. And you're going to see your second year is going to be better than your first year as you clean up those pastures. You're going to have less and less parasite problems. One thing about the fenbendazole, it's got a 100x margin of safety. It will not hurt an animal. When it kills the parasite, how it kills the parasite, it can be ingested. They can ingest the safeguard or absorb it, but they can't excrete it. It's a very large molecule. So if they come up to the feed bunk today and they get some safeguard, maybe they get crowded out tomorrow and they come back up the third or fourth day. What's there the first day is still in that parasite. So when it gets enough, it'll destroy it. So by spreading that dose over 3 to 4 days, you make sure everybody gets their dose, and that'll absolutely clean them up, and then come back in behind with your combination with Cydectin, make sure they're totally clean. There's no taste or smell of safeguard. So, if your animals sometimes goats don't like the pellets, you can either smash them up or you can buy a flake meal with safeguard in it, and that'll work very well. So just to finish up, this is our address, this is our website, Mid-America Ag Research, so feel free to use it. Feel free to go in and take a look at the information on there. So with that, I will stop and turn this back over. Tyra, are you around? You
Yep.
need me to click off?
Thank you, Don.
Aaron, right?
Appreciate that, Don.
Yep, no problem.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Hey, everyone. I'm Kyra Woods. I'm the Merck Animal Health Representative in Eastern Kansas and a part of Missouri. And I wanted to share with you, we do have a current promotion running on our Safeguard dewormer for goats. If you purchase 6 of the 125 ml bottles of Safeguard or 1 liter of Safeguard and fill out this coupon with your proof of purchase, you will get a Safeguard free drenching gun with your purchase. So I provided this coupon to Kent and his group, and they will be able to make a copy of this for you to where you can mail it in with your proof of purchase. And Don and I are going to be on the phone here, so if you have any questions for us, we'd be happy to entertain those now.
We sure like Kyra for all their to put this program together, and when we called Kyra, she jumped right on helping us with this program. We sure appreciate everything you guys have done. One of the questions we had was, I know you went over it there a little bit, but the vet will send a person into the store here and say, I need a class 1, class 2, or class 3 wormer. What's the best way to define that?
Well, the class 1 wormer is typically what you'd look at with Rumetel or levamisole, and basically what their label claims are for adult parasites only. So they don't kill the ones in the tissues as well as the type 2 dewormer. So Safeguard is really what you call a type 2 dewormer, the ivermectins as well. and they kill all stages of the parasite basically in the animal. The only exception to that is those inhibited parasites that are hard to kill by all. The one that does the best job really is the Sidectin, but the problem with Sidectin, if you use it alone, it kills the larvae in situ, which means it kills them in the gut, and they can cause an anaphylactic reaction, and you lose an animal just from that. So that's why we like to use the Safeguard ahead of it and do that combination. You're getting what Safeguard does, comes in and kills all the active parasites, and when they die off, as they die off rapidly, the ones in the tissue come out, and you get those with the Sidectin. Safeguard cannot kill an inhibited parasite
Don,
that
you're
is not
cutting out.
metabolized. Oh, sorry.
On us.
The Safeguard can't kill an inhibited parasite. None of the parasiticides can do that very well, but it can activate them so they are in an available state to kill them. So,
Think another. I lot. Did you guys hear that question?
no, I didn't.
We got a question. If a pasture rotation is not an option, is dry lotting the next best?
Absolutely, yeah. If you're having a real problem on pasture, you want to get them dewormed and move them over into a dry lot and get them off that pasture. Yeah. Now, if you've got like a hay field that you can put up a temporary fence, that's a worm-free area. Anywhere the animals haven't been will work as a worm-free area, but you got to get them off that pasture if it's already contaminated.
That is the questions we've had. We sure appreciate you guys and all the effort you're doing. And we get any more questions, we'll get them sent to you guys so we can get our producers the answers they need. Like I say, this will be up on our Facebook page. It'll also be up on our YouTube channel. So anybody who has time can go back and watch. And we sure appreciate everything. And thank you guys.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.